Good evening. Welcome to the University of St. Thomas. Can you not hear? You can hear me. You're waving hello. Thank you. Okay. Welcome all. We're so glad you're here. Those of you downstairs, those of you upstairs in the balcony, welcome to all. From on campus, from off campus, faculty, students, and people from the greater Twin Cities area and beyond. It's my privilege. I'm Philip Rolnick, professor of theology and the chair of the Science and Theology Network, and I'd like to acknowledge the support for this talk from the Siena Symposium for Women, Family, and Culture, first of all, the Catechetical Institute, and also Relevant Radio, which has very graciously run 30-second spots for a whole week to let folks know that we have Father Robert Spitzer here tonight. And it's now my privilege to tell you something about Father Robert Spitzer. He is an internationally renowned and admired Catholic leader. He was president of Gonzaga University from 1998 to 2009. While there, he significantly increased the programs and the curricula in faith, in ethics, service, and leadership, and he led the efforts to build 20 new facilities. He increased the student population by 75%, and he raised more than $200 million for scholarships and capital projects. Since leaving Gonzaga, he has become the president of the Magis Center. Magis has the Latin sense of more or more than, and the mission of the Magis Center is to restore, reconstruct, and revitalize belief in God and the transcendent dignity of every human person, the significance of virtue, the higher levels of happiness, love, and freedom, and the real presence of our Lord Jesus Christ. He's appeared on television numerous times, including the Larry King Show, where he debated Stephen Hawking. That was unfair to Stephen Hawking, I'd say. The Today Show, where he debated the topic of euthanasia, the History Channel, where he spoke on God and the universe, a PBS series called Closer to the Truth, and the Hugh Hewitt Radio Show. He currently appears weekly on EWTN television in a show humbly and appropriately called Father Spitzer's Universe. Besides hundreds of presentations to colleges and universities, Father Spitzer has spoken to many troubled spots across the globe. He has spoken to Tony Blair's cabinet in London, officials of the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia, both sides of the conflict in Northern Ireland, government officials in El Salvador, and numerous other hotspots. In 1989, Father Spitzer received Georgetown University's Edward T. Bunn Award for Most Outstanding Professor at the university. In 1997, he won the same, very similar award at Seattle University, Most Outstanding Professor. You begin to see a pattern. In 2009, he was awarded the Gonzaga University's highest honor, the Desmond Medal. He has recently undertaken a work of tremendous importance in a curriculum development, which he developed himself for middle school and high school students, Catholic students. He discovered the motivation for this curriculum development was that he discovered that 42% of those students were projected to leave the church beginning at the mean age of 13 and become either atheist or agnostic. Well, Father Spitzer thought he'd do something about it, so he developed a curriculum which has had tremendous success. It is currently in 116 of 192 dioceses in the United States, and it's blanketing the entire country of Ireland. It is having an effect, and it can be found on a website that you'll see in his presentation called crediblecatholic.com. In addition to these other things, he has published 10 books books that are very well sold, numerous articles on the human person, leadership in business, happiness, and science and Christian faith, the topic on which he'll speak tonight, a topic on which he is duly famous and loved everywhere. I find myself, having known Father Spitzer some years now, that he's the kind of leader that the church, the education, including this university, and the larger society very much need. So would you join me in welcoming Father Robert Spitzer?
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming out on a perfectly nice, wintry Tuesday evening. I hope to make this a really interesting talk for you. I could have renamed the talk Science at the Doorstep to God, because I decided to really try and take a look at some breadth about where science really is touching faith on a variety of different levels. So rather than giving a talk tonight about early cosmology of the early universe and maybe the implications of creation, I'm going to do a smattering talk. I'm going to give some areas of cosmology, the early universe. We're going to talk a little bit about the soul, transphysical soul, just as a way of seeing whether or not closet materialism is really justified, that I'm just a bunch of atoms and molecules, nothing more, that oftentimes comes out not only in high school, but now in middle school curricula, that I think really needs to be examined in light of peer-reviewed medical studies of near-death experiences and a phenomenon called terminal lucidity. And then I want to take a look at, can science even touch on Jesus Christ? And with the recent debunking, which I'll talk about in a moment, of the 1988 carbon dating of the Shroud of Turin, I want to just give you some samples of what science can uncover about this remarkable, most scientifically tested historical artifact in the history of humankind. So that's my sort of ambitious agenda. Here we go with the smattering. Before I begin, though, I do want to just tackle a couple of myths that have come out just more and more of late. And a lot of our students buy the myths. They're just simply not true. Myth number one: scientists are mostly agnostic or atheist. They're not. In the recent Pew Survey, 2018 Pew Survey of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, 51% of scientists are theists. That would be a majority, a really slim, simple majority, but it's a majority. 41% are either agnostic or atheist. 10% are undeclared. So just to complement that with physicians, 88%, by the way, this is from the National Center for Disease Control, 88% of physicians are religiously affiliated. Let me repeat that. 88%. I mean, physicians, along with engineers and a few other technical areas, are basically the most scientific professions, the most faith-filled professions around. And of that 88%, 67% are either moderately or very active in their religious affiliation. Just a few other things to note. Second myth, the Catholic Church is not against science. Never has been against science. Just as an example, the Catholic Church has its own Pontifical Academy of Sciences with lots of Nobel Prize winners. The Jesuits, I think 4 of whom are sitting here today, also have a rather large observatory connected with the University of Arizona. And we do bipolar observations of all kinds of black holes and interesting things. And priests in general have been involved in the forefront of the development of science. I mean, how could the church be anti-science when one of the fathers of heliocentrism that actually offered the first mathematical justification of a heliocentric solar system, uh, Nicholas Copernicus, the Copernican revolution, was a Catholic cleric? How could the father of quantitative genetics, Gregor Mendel, remember him? Augustinian monk, abbot, priest. Uh, hmm, Very interesting. How could the father of contemporary geology and stratigraphy, Nicholas Steno, who was basically a Catholic bishop, how in the world can we start seeing? But even more amazing, I know that everybody attributes the discovery of the Big Bang Theory to Edwin Hubble. He was certainly really important in the validation of that. But the first one to discover the Big Bang Theory by combining the general theory of relativity with its malleable space-time curvature, he applied that to the universe as a whole for the first time in 1927, 3 years before Hubble's survey of the heavens. He was the one that went to Einstein and said, this is the solution to the recessional velocity of extragalactic nebulae. This is, which was a very important, problem. And this got resolved in short order. But Einstein just couldn't believe him. He just said, by the way, he was a colleague of Einstein's. He did have a PhD from MIT in physics. He's not an unintelligent guy. And so he basically said, here's the solution to the problem. Einstein said, the mathematics is brilliant, but the physics is preposterous. Imagine an expanding universe. 3 years later, after the survey of the heavens, Einstein apologized and said to Lemaitre himself, this is the most satisfying explanation of creation that I've ever heard. By the way, we still have Lemaitre all over the place in physics. Lemaitre Walker spacetime, Lemaitre constant, et cetera, et cetera. So these are priests. If you want to get a really interesting article, go to Science Priest Wiki. Just take a look at those 37 guys. We are not against science. That, as a church, just the best myth ever, wrongo bongo. Okay. Third thing that's really important. Much as science is a remarkable thing, a remarkable discipline, I've done so much, I won't even go into it. But, alas, science cannot disprove God, ladies and gentlemen. The myth is out there. Science has disproved God. Here's the problem in 3 steps. Step number 1. Every scientifically established fact or datum must be based on observational data. Observation, really important. Point number 2. All observational data must come from within the event horizon of our universe. There isn't any observational data outside of our universe because we can't get any. That's the problem. Point number 3. God is outside of the universe. There's a way of establishing this in many different ways through metaphysical proofs, but the main thing is, of course, God is outside of the universe. How are you going to use observational data that must be taken from within the universe to disprove a God that's outside of the universe? Not possible. Even this came up in a little debate with Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow on the Larry King show. And even Larry King got it. We can get it. The point is, honestly, we can get it. It's okay. But science cannot disprove God. Again, wrongo bongo. Number 4. The fourth thing is, there are many things that science can't do. But the first thing is, we have to totally reject scientism. Scientism is this statement writ large. Every valid fact that can be known must be either scientifically validatable or scientifically falsifiable. Did you hear that statement? That's what it says. But that word every, that's a universal. Science is based on observational data, which means that its data is particular. It is conditioned by specific space and time coordinates. There's no every in science at all. So listen to this statement. Every valid fact must be either scientifically validatable or falsifiable. That statement, with its universal, can never be validated through science because science must validate particulars in space-time conditions, meaning it's self-refuting. That statement is self-refuting. It cannot be validated by the criterion it establishes for truth. Now, there's many other things that are myths out there, but this is enough to just get people to be a little suspicious about what might be cruising around on the internet, Facebook, Instagram, and other, viewpoints that are not sometimes particularly sympathetic to a theistic position. But scientists are sympathetic to a theistic position. They really are, contrary to the myths. Let's go to the next thought that is really important, and that is what's going on in cosmology. So this is my first area that oh yeah, thank you. What's going on in cosmology today that's really of significance to us as theists? If you take a look at this upside down triangle for just a moment, I just want to talk very briefly about three areas, and then I want to look at the summation of the evidence. I'd like to talk about the Board of Vilenkin and Guth proof, but in principle, I'd like to talk about proofs in general that we call space-time geometry proofs. So that's going to be my first thought. My second thought is going to be on the evidence from entropy, and the third is going to be with respect to what I'll call it just right now, the initial conditions and constants of the universe that seem to have what we might call fine-tuning for life in their numbers, fine-tuning for life. Okay, let's just quickly go through the first thing. Space-time geometry proofs. There actually are a set of proofs that can lead, if you elucidate the conditions, to a beginning of the universe. So if X is true, Y is true, and Z is true, you can actually prove that it must lead to a beginning of the universe, or, as we shall see, even a beginning of a multiverse, or, as we shall see, even a beginning of a string universe in the higher dimensional space of string theory. Now, I'm going to skip all the history behind all of this. I just want to skip to 2003, where three physicists came out and constructed the theorem which basically shows the need for a beginning of all such universes, multiverses, etc. How does it work? It's called the Board of Vilenkin and Guth proof, coming from Arvind Borda at the University of California of Santa Barbara, and then Dr. Alexander Vilenkin, he's the director of the Institute of Cosmology at Tufts University in Boston, and Dr. Alan Guth, who has a high chair of cosmology there at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Now, these three guys got together in 2003 and made this wonderful proof. It has 6 steps. And how do you get to all 6 steps of this proof in a non-mathematical way? And if you're mathematical, in a mathematical way. You go to a website called crediblecatholic.com. Then you click on what's called the Big Book. You'll be given some options, the 7 essential modules, the Big Book, and the Little Book. Click on the Big Book. Go to Volume 1, and there it all is. If you want the equations are there. If you want the 6 steps, they're there. But for this lecture, you're going to have to take my word for it. Right now, what they proved is that any physical configuration of reality that has an average Hubble expansion greater than 0 must have a beginning. In other words, if you have a universe, that's one kind of physical configuration of physical reality, and that universe has an average Hubble expansion. Hubble expansion is just the expansion of the universe as a whole. So instead of, thinking of the universe as expanding in pre-existent space, think instead that the universe is actually growing because space and time between the galaxies is stretching and growing. So if that expansion rate is greater than zero, you're going to have a beginning. Whether you have a universe, a multiverse, a string universe in the higher dimensional space, a string theory, or an oscillating universe, you're going to have a beginning. Now, there have been no shortage of attempts since 2003 to disprove this proof because it is very inconvenient for a lot of physicists who do not want to believe in a beginning implying a creator. But they haven't been able to do it thus far because it's a simple, elegant proof and it has huge applicability. Why so? Well, our universe can be empirically shown to have an average expansion rate greater than zero. So it's going to have a beginning by BVG. That means Board of Vilenkin and Guth, by BVG. Secondly, every single multiverse will always have to have a beginning according to BVG because you can't have a multiverse without inflation. Inflation is the rapid expansion of the space-time continuum. Every multiverse, the only way you can have a multiverse is through rapid expansion that leads to these bubble universes forming within the multiverse. So every multiverse must have an average expansion rate greater than zero. And so according to BVG, it too must require a beginning. Thirdly, string universes in the higher dimensional space of string theory. And there's some of these theories that are like string universes on steroids, like the Steinhardt-Turok proposal. And the Steinhardt, where you have 2 3-dimensional membranes, and sandwiched between them is a 4-dimensional bulk space-time, and the 3-dimensional membranes are going in the 4-dimensional bulk space-time and colliding and creating, burping out literally other universes and nucleating therefrom. Every single one of these nucleating string universes, because they're nucleating and they go into a higher and higher diameter, will and therefore circumference, will always have to have an average expansion rate greater than zero. Every one of them. By the way, all oscillating universes that begin with an expansion, then go to a contraction, then expand further out, and then go to a contraction, they too will have to have an average expansion rate greater than zero. Ladies and gentlemen, we do not have a single example of one configuration of physical reality, universe, multiverse, string universe, oscillating universe, that's a bouncing universe, expanding, contracting. We don't have a single one that does not have an average expansion rate greater than zero, meaning that every last one of them has to have a beginning. Now, that's a very interesting thought, because if they have a beginning, as we'll see in a moment, that implies a creator. Hold on, I'll get to that. Let's first go to a second area of evidence, and that's called entropy. Entropy just basically means a breakdown of the organization of a physical system. And a universe or a multiverse is a physical system. Now, the key point to remember is everything is just running down. Everything is getting used up. Physical systems only have a finite amount of organization, right? Organization just means disequilibrium in them, through which disequilibrium some work can be done. But every single time work is done within a physical system, it loses some of its disequilibrium. It loses some of its organization. So that if a physical system with a finite amount of disequilibrium or organization, it has been around for an infinite amount of time, that universe, that physical system, that multiverse is deado deadere. Now, I know that Sean Carroll has tried to say that a multiverse can get around the problem of entropy. But there are lots of people like Thomas Banks, who are very valid people, who will show 10 to the 500th reasons why that is not necessarily true at all. So for all intents and purposes, as far as I know, Einstein is still right about entropy. If every single physical law in universes or speculative multiverses or string universes, if every single one of them falls, there will be one that will exist at the end. Entropy, the second law of thermodynamics. Physical systems over the course of time will get used up. Therefore, we ought to have a dead universe. And if there's a multiverse, it ought to be a dead multiverse in which our dead universe is in. That's what we ought to have if the universe or multiverse has been around for an infinite amount of time. But the inconvenient fact is we do not have a dead universe. We don't, and of course we don't even know if there's a multiverse. It's outside of the event horizon of our universe. Notwithstanding this, we have to consider the possibility, at least hypothetically, and that too would have to have a beginning by entropy and so forth. Now, what's my point? My point is that when you combine the evidence of entropy with the evidence of the Bordova-Lincoln and Guth proof, two completely different sets of evidence, they converge on one single conclusion. All known configurations of physical systems and physical reality seem to need a beginning. Now, that's an interesting thought. Here's what Alexander Vilenkin says about this. This is a conclusion he made in his book, in a 2006 book, Many Universes in One. And here's how, I'm going to just paraphrase it as best I can remember. It is said that a good argument will convince a reasonable person, and that a proof will convince even an unreasonable one. But now that the proof is in place, what proof? The Bordova-Lincoln and Guth, he's the V in the BVG proof. The Bordova-Lincoln and Guth proof and the entropy evidence. Now that the proof is in place, cosmologists who study the early universe, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the very possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape, and they must confront the reality of a beginning. There is no escape. They must confront the problem of a beginning. Now, why is that so important? Because a beginning in physical reality is a beginning of physical time and physical space itself. That means that prior to the beginning, if we hold true to this, physical reality was nothing. Now, I know Stephen Hawking said that gravitational laws were nothing. But really, gravitational laws, even the theoretical, configuration of gravitational laws is not nothing. There's something. Nothing is nothing. Don't sneak something into nothing. That's not good. Even zero energy conditions of quantum fields and false fluctuations within quantum fields are not nothing. They're like my bank account. Frequently, there's no money in it, but the bank account still exists. It's not nothing. So, the point I'm trying to get to is, if you don't sneak something into nothing, then when physical reality was nothing, it could not have moved itself from nothing to something, because the only thing it could do when it was nothing is nothing, because that's the only thing nothing can do. Nothing. Now, if that's the case, if the universe could not have moved itself from nothing to something because it was nothing and could only do nothing, then something else would have to move it from nothing to something. And that something else would have to be trans-temporal, trans-physical. Trans means beyond. Beyond time, beyond space, beyond physics. Indeed, would even have to create something out of nothing. That would seem to be sort of like God. And that's the implication. We are at a very curious point in the history of physics, where physics is actually pointing toward something like a trans-temporal creator. rather than simply a self-sufficient universe, which doesn't seem to work. Now, Stephen Hawking, very interestingly, had his birthday party in 2012, and Alexander Vilenkin went over to read his paper there. And Lisa Grossman, who was covering it for the New York Times, said, "It was the worst birthday present ever." And of course, the reason is pretty clear, because it didn't get the result that Hawking, of course, had expected. Let's go to a third area, though, and that's fine-tuning of our universe. I'm going to do this rather rapidly. There are various initial conditions and constants at the Big Bang. It's important to do this at the Big Bang, and the reason is because if you can see order in the initial conditions and constants at the Big Bang, then you can't make recourse to a prior natural or physical condition as the cause of that order. Why? Because the Big Bang, or what's called sometimes the singularity of the Big Bang, that singularity is like a space-time boundary. It actually dismembers causation. You can't have a cause before the Big Bang unless it's a transcendent cause, right? You can't have a physical cause before the Big Bang that's going to be connected to the physics of the universe after the Big Bang, because the singularity interrupts that. So the order has to be there from the beginning. Very interesting. So let's take a look at just a few examples of what this is like so you can get a flavor for it. And then I don't want to belabor it. But what it does do is point to an intelligent God. By the way, I just finished the central article for a book called Theism and Atheism, Philosophical Arguments in Opposition. It's a Macmillan reference book that just came out. If you're interested in that, I think you can just get the separate article. You don't have to pay the $200 for the book, or have your library order it. Just kidding. But I mean, the main thing, though, is in this book, I really do bring this argument out in much, much greater detail. But here's the simple approach right now. Just think of it this way. You need low entropy for a life form, everybody. Low entropy means high order. Lots of usable energy still left in our universe. So we need a high order universe with lots of usable energy in order to get a life form. Not only to have a life form come about, but also to gradually evolve from single cell to multi-cell, etc., organisms throughout. So low entropy, really important. Now, this physicist over at Oxford, Roger Penrose, actually calculated what the odds would be against the low entropy of our universe happening by pure chance. Remember, life forms depend on it. It's 10 raised to the 10 raised to the 123 to 1 against. Now, that's a double exponent. So it's 10, and then in the exponent, a 1 followed by 123 zeros in the exponent. A trillion, 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 in the exponent. Now, that's a really big number. If you basically take every zero and made it 10-point type and wrote that number out in ordinary notation, our solar system would not hold that number. It's the same odds as a monkey typing the entire corpus of Shakespeare by random tapping of the keys in a single try. That's highly improbable. The low entropy of our universe is that highly improbable. It'd be like you giving the monkey stern instructions to go and type the works of Shakespeare. The monkey, not having understood the command, begins randomly tapping on the keys. You come back 2 months later, there's Macbeth in perfect folio condition and Hamlet in perfect folio condition. And you begin to think to yourself, wow, this is highly unusual. And of course, it would be highly unusual. Well, if physicists proposed that low entropy of our universe at 10 to the 10 to the 123 to 1 against happened by pure chance, that's how ridiculous it is. It's not even worthy of scientific hypothesis and conjecture. It leaves only two options, ladies and gentlemen: a multiverse with at least 10 raised to the 10 raised to the 123 bubble universes that have been generated in it, so that we can have but one of bubble universe like our own amidst the 10 to the 10 to the 123 wasted ones. That could be. That's an option. The other option is a really smart, transcendent, creative agency with an intelligence very, very capable of making low entropy in our universe a possibility by our own space-time configurations. Now, let's just think about this for just 1 second. What's wrong with the multiverse as being a good option? 3 things. Remember, every multiverse must have a beginning according to BVG, and probably according to entropy. Number 2, every single multiverse is falls prey to what we call the Boltzmann brain and the brief brain problem. A multiverse, right, is highly improbable, and a multiverse which can give rise to a bubble universe like our own is super highly improbable. In fact, if such a multiverse exists, the odds are much, 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 much greater that you would be a Boltzmann brain, that you would be a brain that literally materialized, poof, with all of the memories you have of this entire universe and the world around you and all the people in this auditorium already prepackaged in your brain, and then disappeared moments later. We all ought to be Boltzmann brains, because the odds are much greater that we should be than have one bubble universe like our own that is generated supposedly, out of pure chance. If we've got that many bubble universes with that possibility, thermoflux, you'd have all kinds of Boltzmann brains. And there's another problem, it's called brief brains, I won't go into tonight, but it really makes multiverses seem highly improbable. There's a third problem with the multiverse. Every last one of them has to be fine-tuned in their initial conditions. Why? Because multiverses, you can't just have randomly generated bubble universes burping out of multiverses. You've got to have a lot of fine-tuning to make sure that the bubble universes aren't bumping into one another. Because when universes bump, oh my gosh, it makes huge perturbations, not only among the two universes, but in the multiverse itself. Huge space-time gravitational perturbations that shake the whole universe like a jello, which is exceedingly bad for the development of life forms, even in a universe like our own. So in order to prevent this terrible tragedy from happening, you're going to have a whole lot of fine-tuning for a slow roll of bubble universes coming out of the multiverse. Which begs the question, where did that fine-tuning come from? Meaning all we can do with a multiverse currently is make the problem go back one step. But we still run into the same problem of inexplicable fine-tuning. What's my point? It may just be that a smart God is much more likely and much more preferable than a multiverse with its intrinsic difficulties, challenges. And I'm just saying that's where things are. Oh, but it doesn't stop there at low entropy. It even goes to other things. For example, we have just about 20 constants, what we call universal constants that are in our universe, and they control all the laws of physics. These are numbers that actually control the way things relate to each other, or the kinds of radii or volumetric proportionality that occurs between acting physical systems or kinds of energy. For example, you have the Hubble constant, which is very important for the expansion rate of the universe, the cosmological constant. Everybody who studied Physics 101, you know Planck's constant. We have 4 forces in our universe: the electromagnetic force, the strong nuclear force, the weak force, and the gravitational force. Now, those 4 forces all have constants associated with them. The gravitational force has a gravitational constant. The weak force has the weak force constant. Strong nuclear force has the strong nuclear force coupling constant. And the electromagnetic force has three constants: the mass of the proton, the mass of the electron, and the electromagnetic charge. Now, let's just throw a few of these babies off from the actual numbers they had at the Big Bang, supposedly by pure chance. So, for example, if you were to take the weak force constant relative to the gravitational constant, and you were to vary that by 1 part in 10 to the 50th, from the number it just happened to have at the Big Bang, 1 part in 10 to the 50th, higher or lower, that's a decimal point with 49 zeros and a 1. Teeny little fraction, teeny. And you're just sitting there, if you varied it by 1 part in 10 to the 50th, higher or lower, then every single life form in the universe would be eliminated. Because either the universe would be continuously exploding violently in its expansion to this very day, which is really bad for life forms, or alternatively, the universe would collapse in upon itself into a Schwarzschild black hole with almost an infinite crushing capacity, and where the entire mass density of the universe is collapsed into 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, which is also exceedingly bad for life forms. For all intents and purposes, that's it, you guys. You mean we avoided complete cosmological disaster for all life forms by 1 part in 10 to the 50th in these two constants? Yep. You know the odds of that happening by pure chance at the Big Bang? Monkey typing Macbeth, basically. And let's just go to, a few other examples, and you'll get the point. Let's suppose we altered the mass of the proton, the mass of the electron, or the electromagnetic force by 1 part in 10 to the 39. 1 part in 10 to the 39. Then, of course, we would have convective instability everywhere. Every single star in our universe would either be a blue giant or a red dwarf. Not like the kinds of friendly stars we have out there right now. If every star in the universe were a blue giant, a big, huge, gigantic, exploding star, continuously exploding, it would fry everything in every galaxy, which is really bad for life forms. Alternatively, if every star in the universe were a red dwarf, which has so little heat, so little thermal, fluctuation, convection, basically it wouldn't even give a Hawaiian a tan. For all intents and purposes, the universe would be frozen, which is really bad for life forms. I mean, we avoided complete cosmological catastrophe for every possible life form by 1 part in 10 to the 39 and these three constants? Yep. You know the odds of that happening? Monkey typing Macbeth and Hamlet by random tapping of the keys in a single try. And it goes on and on. You know, if you altered the strong nuclear force by a mere 10% higher or lower, you wouldn't have any life forms. If you altered it by 2% higher, you'd have no hydrogen in our universe whatsoever. That's bad for stars. That's bad for water. That's bad for all kinds of things, no life form. Alternatively, if you lowered it by 2%, you wouldn't have any element heavier than hydrogen. Go ahead. Build a complex life form with only hydrogen. It's not going to happen. For all intents and purposes, once again, we face that dilemma. Now, all I can say is, I'll just give you a couple of quotes to wind up this section. I want to get on to two other things that are really important. The first thing I want to say is, if you combine those 3 points on that triangle, that upside-down triangle, the creation hypothesis is not at all an empty hypothesis. This is a really feasible, good hypothesis worthy of reasonable and responsible belief, because it may just be scientifically better because of BVG, because of entropy, and because of the inexplicable fine-tuning not only of our universe, but the necessity of it in multiverses. It just may be the best scientifically plausible explanation of our universe, multiverses, etc. And that's an interesting thing, because that implies not only an intelligent, not only a creator outside of space and time, but a creation by an intelligent creator outside of space and time. This is what Fred Hoyle, remember Sir Fred Hoyle? He was, by the way, one of the guys who was really important in a whole series of cosmological discoveries. But anyway, he was the atheistic gadfly of the physics community for years and years and years. Well, a few years before he died, his good partner, William Fowler, came up to him and said, "Oh, Fred, I just thought you might be interested in seeing the odds against an abundance of carbon happening in our universe by pure chance." And Hoyle went, "Oh, what's this about?" So, of course, he looks at the equations that Fowler presents, and he came up with this line in response, which is something we ought to have in the face of these three data points coming at us from contemporary cosmology. He says, "I do not think there are any blind forces worth speaking about. It seems to me that some super calculating, super intellect has monkeyed with the constants of physics and those of chemistry and biology as well. I consider this conclusion to be beyond the pale, beyond the shadow of a doubt." That was the former atheistic gadfly. He later compared an abundance of carbon in our universe happening by pure chance to be the same odds as a tornado sweeping through a junkyard, literally constructing a Boeing 747 ready for flight. Unusual, at the very least. But we've reached a very interesting point in physics. Reasonable and responsible belief may well favor theism. Any wonder why a majority of scientists, including most especially physicists, are theists? That's interesting. We ought to tell the kids about this. Number two, you are not a collection of molecules and atoms. Now, I know you bring up near-death experiences, and everybody's got an anecdote about it, and you got to be very careful about it. But I do want to now talk about this just very briefly. Yes, there are many stories. I don't want to discount any anecdotes, but I don't think we should be dependent on them. We should be using peer-reviewed medical studies of near-death experiences. I think there are several of them. You can see them up there. The Samuel Parnia study from 2014 at Southampton University in Britain, 2,060 patients, published in the peer-reviewed journal Resuscitation. Very important article, establishes quite conclusively that the veridical data, and I'll talk about the veridical data in just a moment, that the veridical data of people who were clinically dead means flat EEG, fixed and dilated pupils, no gag reflex. So basically what you're dealing with is no electromagnetic energy in the cerebral cortex or the frontal cortex, and mere sputterings of neurons in the lower brain. That's it. No electricity in the cerebral and frontal cortex. Got to tell you right now, not going to be a whole lot of thinking activity going on in that brain. Not a lot of remembering activity going on in that brain. Yet when they are dead, these people are leaving their body, report that they're leaving their body, and they can see, they can hear, they can think, they can remember, they have full lucidity of the memories that they had when they were in their bodies, but they're above and beyond their bodies, looking at everything that's going on in the universe. And in the Parnia study in particular, it's rather interesting because there were beeps of machines that could be timed. And as we'll see in one case of a blind boy momentarily, the train schedule can be verified for when this person was actually dead, so that we can coordinate what's going on in the room almost second by second with what people who are clinically dead are reporting with 100% veridical accuracy. That means verifiable accuracy by independent researchers after the fact. This is amazing. And the Parnia study, as I said, is a really great one. At the end of the day, Parnia says there are 64 cases that cannot be explained out of that 2,060. There's just no way of explaining this unless there is some kind of survival the human consciousness, sight, hearing, etc., after physical death. There's another one that's very good, goes back to 2001, but really excellent, from the Netherlands, 360 patients, which was the Pim van Lommel and colleagues study. So all these are done by multiple doctors, right, over the course of multiple hospitals in multiple countries over a long period of time, with all of the statistical precautions taken into effect, that would be normal for a statistical study of this magnitude. So these are published in good peer-reviewed journals. The Pim van Lommel study is in the Lancet, which is the number one prestigious medical journal of Great Britain. What's my point? Stick with the peer-reviewed medical data, and you will have no problem beginning to think, I'm very likely to survive my bodily death, and my consciousness will not only exist and be thinking and remembering, it's actually going to transcend physical laws. I'll go right through hospital walls. I'll be able to go right up through the ceiling here and defy gravity. Yippee! I'll be able to do all of it, and at the same time, I might even get transported to a beautiful heavenly kingdom where there's a beautiful white light that is filled with consolation, that takes away all forms of suffering. And as a matter of fact, I might be transported even to see my deceased relatives and friends. And more than that, there could be, in a few cases, dark experiences. And those dark experiences also would be very, very telling indeed. And that comes out especially in the Parnia study as well, which those things are studied. But let's go back to that veridical data and why some of this is important. Veridical data just means unusual data that somebody couldn't have guessed would have happened or wouldn't have been able to describe by having read about other near-death experiences and clinical death. So if somebody said, well, a nurse came and put paddles on me and resuscitated me, that won't work because, of course, too normal. You could have read about that in any journal. But if you can actually report data that is completely unknown, unpredictable from previous studies, now that's worth something, but you have to report it 100% accurately. Now let me tell you, these good studies like the Janice Holden study takes 37 of these veridical studies that have been done. And the strictest criterion for accuracy, 100% accuracy, which, by the way, far outpaces anything that happens in any courtroom ever in the United States. I mean, witness value. I mean, you want 100% accuracy, most evidence in a courtroom would be ruled out. But that's the strictest criterion used in these studies. What's interesting to note is that we have thousands of cases of that kind of veridical data. Mr. So-and-so, we lost your dentures. No, you really didn't lose my dentures. The nurse with the red hair pulled them right out of my mouth right before they put the paddles on me, and she pulled out a drawer underneath the machine that looks just like this and threw the dentures into the drawer and slammed it. I said, hey, those are my dentures. And of course, they go back. She says, you just go back and you find that machine that looks like this, open the drawer, and you'll find, there they are. Who knew? Or one woman who just says, oh, well, I left my body and I just went right outside the hospital walls. And I was hovering up there on the third floor. And I was looking back at the hospital. And I noticed that on the ledge was a tennis shoe with the shoelace stuck under the heel and a worn left toe. One of Dr. Melvin Morse's assistants actually crawled out on that ledge. Click, 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 click. There was the shoe precisely as described. Who knew? And by the way, do not speak badly of the dead because they can go right through the operating room into the waiting room next door and see and hear everything you are saying. Just saying, this happens all the time. People are utterly shocked. I was right there in the waiting room with you. I was trying to tell you I was okay, but you were saying that I was an idiot. And so, no, just enough said. But the point I'm trying to make is this veridical data happens all the time. We have thousands of cases of 100% accurate reporting, and so it's really very, very persuasive. And in the Parnia study, it's as he said, he has a whole host of these cases that simply are inexplicable with the timing elements already provided. So you got almost have a second by, or a multiple second by multiple second correlation. Second area that's really important is veridical data reported by blind people. 81% of blind people, most of whom were blind from birth, most of those people, 81%, can see for the first time when they are clinically dead. Fixed and dilated pupils, no gag reflex, flat EEG. Just saying. Now, here's the problem with that. Every physicalist explanation which tries to explain veridical data, or tries to explain near-death experiences by making an appeal to the physical brain, it's not going to work. Because blind people, ladies and gentlemen, have no visual images in their brain to hallucinate. It doesn't matter how you would manufacture the stimulation of the parietal lobe, the stimulation, right, of the temporal lobe, hallucinogenic drugs, anoxia. It doesn't matter. All hallucinatory explanations from the physical brain, non va. They don't work. They don't go. Why? There's nothing in that physical brain of any visual quality to hallucinate. How in the world did they do it? Now, we have a wonderful set of embedded videos. If you go to crediblecatholic.com, you click on this big red button called the 7 Essential Modules. And in those modules, we have embedded videos. And one of the videos that just jaw drops the high school kids is when this blind kid, he's 16 years old, he says, yeah, when I died, I went right through the hospital walls. And as I was looking out there, I saw snow for the very first time. I'd, of course, felt snow in the ground, and I'd heard it crunch under my feet, but I saw actual train tracks making dents in the snow, and I saw this train pulling away. And we know the train schedule, right? The train is pulling away, and it's making this right turn up the horizon, and it has an arrow on a big sign, an arrow pointing to the right on a big sign on the back of that train. And there's trees on either side of the train tracks. Hey, this kid couldn't have possibly known any of it. He's been blind from birth, and he's outside the hospital walls in a place where his parents and everybody have testified he's never been before. And he's giving second-by-second accurate accounts of what's going on. Just saying. It jaw drops people. How did you do that unless your consciousness survived bodily death, along with the vision you never had in your physical body? I don't know. But all I can tell you is 81% of blind people see for the first time when they're clinically dead. And there ain't no explanation for it. It seems, again, it's really likely you're going to survive bodily death. Number 3, there's a phenomenon that's called death anxiety. You can measure it basically with a modified polygraph, the nervous system. You can tell when so you show them a Rorschach of a shark, a Rorschach of something terrifying, right? Atomic bomb, whatever it is, right? You show people these things, and they have death anxiety responses that can be measured. Everybody has them. Even religious people have them. Why? Because religious people can control their conscious death anxiety, but they can't control the subconscious death anxiety, which affects the sympathetic nervous system measured by the polygraph. You just can't. If I give you something that upsets your subconscious, you can't control it. There's only one case where that happens, where you can control it. That's when people have a near-death experience. So if they leave their bodies, and especially if they see a white light or saintly people that come down, like relatives who meet them, right? They never have any subconscious death anxiety again. It's completely wiped out. It's completely inexplicable. Even little kids, right, who have this, when they're tested 30 years later, still have no death anxiety. It's the only way we've done it. We don't know what happens, but it's just gone. It's like it's erased. There's no subconscious fear, right? We don't know how it happens, but it only happens in near-death experiences. And finally, you've got all these relatives and friends that come back and say various things. Now, my point is, somebody, comes to meet this fellow who comes here, maybe he's a little kid. And the little kid says, "Who are you?" "Oh, I'm your aunt so-and-so." "I didn't even know I had an aunt so-and-so." "That's because I died 10 years before you were born." "Oh, that's great." "I was your mother's sister." "No kidding." "Yeah. And we had a teddy bear, and you go back and you tell her you saw me, and I'm doing just fine. And I told you you had to go back, and the teddy bear's name was Megabyte." I don't know, whatever the teddy bear's name was. And so the little kid goes back, right, and reports all this. Well, the University of Virginia Medical School has an entire research division in the medical school devoted to these near-death experiences. And the Bruce Grayson and these two Kellys have actually reported this stuff. And it's very, very interesting indeed that there are just really hundreds of cases of kids or adults that have come back reporting things that they couldn't have possibly known during this lifetime or didn't know during this lifetime, but suddenly found it out from a relative on the other side. The reports of a beautiful white light, as I said, are there, takes away suffering, definitely is beautiful, very loving. That's certainly intrinsic to about 12% of the total population. That's probably about 65% or so of those who have a near-death experience. You have about, according to the Parnia study, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of about 4% that seems to be very dark experiences, etc. So the one thing is don't count your soul out. Don't sell your soul to a physicalist explanation until you get. By the way, there's a wonderful book out by a guy named Dr. Mario Beauregard, a neuroscientist over at the University of Arizona. It's called Brain Wars. You gotta read this book. It's really excellent. I definitely recommend it if you're interested in this topic. But I'll just rest it there at near-death experiences. There's very likely a soul, and that's been confirmed by some recent evidence in a phenomenon called terminal lucidity. Terminal lucidity is something that we're just beginning to study now at Harvard University, Northwestern University, a few other universities are now beginning to study it on a fairly significant basis. And what it is a phenomenon that seems to take place 1 hour to 24 hours before somebody dies. This would happen, for example, in patients who, well, let's just say they had serious Alzheimer's, for the last 15 years, and their brain is literally full of amyloid plaques. There's no way they're going to be doing any significant cognition. Or somebody who's had terrible brain injuries from birth, right, has had a 50 IQ or lower. Basically, all they could do is make animal sounds throughout their life. Very unfortunate cases, but also other cases where people had hydrocephalus, where the water is filling the cranial cavity and pushing the brain up against the skull, right? So you only got about 10% of your brain left, and it's squished right up there against the top of the skull. So these kinds of things, which can be seen on an MRI, which clearly indicate that a person could not be basically doing any thinking with their brain, because there's either no brain, damaged brain, or really atrophied brain. Okay, now what's the point? These people, 1 hour to 24 hours before they die, wake up, and they are literally as lucid as you and me. They are saying, I got to get my funeral planned. And by the way, for my funeral, I'd like this song and that song, and I need to get my will. I left a lot of these things undone in my will. I know I've been sort of in a dementia condition for the last 25 years, but don't worry, I got it all planned out now, and this is what I'd like you to do. And by the way, I need to say goodbye to the following people. And tell Joe and Harry, I really appreciate all the visits they gave me when I looked like I was completely out of it, but I wasn't out of it. I heard everything that was being said. Wanted to respond. I just couldn't get it through my mouth. But I just wanted to tell you that. And here's some religious songs that I'm going to sing. And these doctors are looking at these people with hydrocephalus and going, "Who are you? Who are you? How is this possible?" Well, I'll tell you one thing. The consciousness is not originating in the brain. It's originating somewhere else. And I would venture to say it's the same transphysical soul. That's the explanation behind near-death experiences. Just saying. I think there's a lot of evidence. I think we're getting to the point now where people are really beginning to entertain, the the value of these studies, these peer-reviewed medical studies of these phenomena. And what it's doing is it's changing our whole view of consciousness, orienting it more and more toward a transphysical ground. You've got, pardon? Left? In the whole thing? I've gone an hour and a half? Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm so sorry. No. I'll get it. I'll just finish up. I'm not going to be able to get to the Shroud of Turin tonight. I'm so sorry. Okay. I'll give you 10 minutes on the Shroud of Turin. Just really quickly. And if you need to leave, go ahead and leave. I'm sorry. Here we go. But all I'm saying is put these two things together. There's a strong likelihood of a soul and a strong likelihood of consciousness, having an origination and locale in that soul rather than in the physical body. Science, again, touching the doorstep of God. Here, let's go to the Shroud of Turin. I just got to give you three quick propedeutic things. By the way, here's his 14-foot shroud. You can see it, there. This is the face of the man. It's a perfect three-dimensional photographic negative image. I'll speak to that more in just a moment. But what I want to get out is there was a 1988 carbon dating that was done that dated the shroud to 350 AD. I'm sorry, to 1350 AD, and that dating took a lot of people off the scientific investigation of the shroud for many, many years. Actually, for 11 years before it was debunked by Ray Rogers, who discovered cotton fibrils in the area where the sample was taken from, and then recently in 2019, it was debunked by Dr. Tristan Casabianca, who is actually a French researcher with his colleagues. They debunked it this year. After 30 years of appealing to the British Museum to get the raw data from the carbon dating, 30 years, this is 1988, 30 years, finally, the British Museum gave it up because of the repeated request on a Freedom of Information Act. They gave up the raw data, and there was a reason they were holding on to the raw data, because there's so much stratification and variation in those samples. I'll tell you this right now. There's no way that those samples could be valid to prove a medieval dating. The stratification within the samples and among the samples, that stratification means at least two kinds of thread from different ages of origin are woven together in the sample. That's bad. That means, why would that happen? Because the Shroud of Turin was caught in the 1500s in a fire at Chambéry, France, at the Chapel of Chambéry. And when that happened, the sisters actually mended, using a technique called invisible mending. They mended threads that were cotton fibers, precisely what several of the researchers found in the sample, in the fibrils of the sample, that they wove cotton fibers that were dyed, right, to look like the color of the linen, with a dye that was only available in Europe in the 11th century. So we know that this has actually occurred, and there are actually, tinges of, chunks of dye that are manifest there. And so basically, Casabianca completely debunked that 1988 carbon dating. In the meantime, before the debunking of the carbon, we knew this was going to happen. That's why Casabianca kept writing to the British Museum. But why did we think that this dating was wrong? Because 4 other dating tests have been performed since that time. The first dating test was done as a Fourier-transformed infrared spectroscopy. Another one was a Raman-Lake spectroscopy. Another one was a mechanical tension compressibility test. And another one was called a vanillin test, the breakdown of a molecule that actually can show the age of a fiber. Now, the main thing is all of those tests, if you take all the data, combine them together, it gives you an age of about 100 AD, plus or minus 150 years, with a 95% confidence level. Come on. You know that 1988 carbon dating was just dead wrong. And of course, it has now been proven to be dead wrong. So now we got to have a new carbon dating, and when that carbon dating is done, the absolute spots of the shroud, it has to be taken from at least 7 different parts of the shroud, that are spots that are proven to be linen, which is what the shroud is. It's linen. Has no cotton in it. The only place it has cotton is where it was repaired after the fire of Chambéry. Enough said. The point is, very highly likely it's dated to that. There's also, by the way, pollen fossils that are embedded in the shroud. Those pollen fossils, the most prolific manifestations are from first century Jerusalem, second from Edessa, Turkey, third from Constantinople, fourth from Liry, France. So, for all intents and purposes, we know that this was probably originated in Jerusalem and hung around Jerusalem for at least 4 centuries, in the open air, way before it was ever taken to France or Constantinople, etc. So that we know that there's coins on the man's eyes. And we'll talk about the origin of the image on the shroud in just a moment. But the coins on the man's eyes have been dated by digital overlay photography by Alan Wonger in peer-reviewed optics journal, and they show that those coins originated from a special minting of Roman leptons by Pontius Pilate in 29 AD. There's 4 enigmas on those coins that are only replicated in 6 coins in the entire numismatic collections in the entire world. And they all come from that special minting of Pontius Pilate in 29 AD. I'm not kidding. Was a very crafty medieval forger. He found the exact coins to put on the man's eyes to fool everybody in the 21st century. Not. And of course, there's a thing called the face cloth of Oviedo. No time to explain it. But the face cloth of Oviedo was the cloth that was used to transport the dead body of the man in the shroud. And that face cloth was wrapped around the shroud because, that you'd have pleural edema fluid coming through the nose, the jaw would be flapping, it would be a terrible, macabre sight because he was beaten so badly. So they put the cloth around it to, transport him to the tomb, take off the face cloth, roll it up, and put it in a place by itself. The linen cloth, the body's then put in the linen cloth, the Shroud of Turin. Now, there's 120 blood stains on that face cloth of Oviedo, which has a provenance that goes back to 616 AD. We can an established provenance in the hands of bishops and finally gets deposited in the Cathedral of Oviedo in 700. Now, if you look at that, there's 120 points of congruence between the bloodstains on the face cloth of Oviedo and the bloodstains of the man on the shroud. There is no way you're going to get 120 points of congruence by pure chance. It's not a monkey typing Shakespeare, but it's really bad. So for all intents and purposes, it didn't happen by pure chance. The point I'm trying to get to is those 2 cloths had to touch the same face. There's just no way that they didn't touch the same face, the same bloody face with the same unusual crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Now, all I'm trying to say is, with the provenance going back to 616 for the face cloth of Oviedo, the Shroud of Turin has to go back to at least 616 AD, and I'll bet you anything it goes right back to the 1st century, just as the coins indicate and the other dating tests indicate. Enough said. I think there's reasonable evidence to suspect this comes right from the 1st century. The body, I don't have time to explain this today, but it has all the unusual characteristics of the unique crucifixion of Jesus Christ, the crown of thorns. By the way, that was a Roman lance that was used, went right between the 4th and the 5th ribs that penetrated right into, and it goes right into the thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity has a buildup of clear fluid in it, goes right up into the heart, and you can see outpoured blood and water. Just saying, really weird that we can actually do this. But there's a triangular tipped lance that's used that's particular to Roman legions. The man was actually whipped 120 times by a Roman flagrant. One guy to the right, one guy to the left. That's an unusually high number of whippings, and there's a reason for that. Don't want to go into it now, but it's definitely a Roman flagrant with bones and chips and a 3-stranded Roman whip that was used on either side of him, the right guy being a little taller than the guy on the left, and they just get him from the neck all the way down the back, all the way down the thighs, all the way down to his feet. I mean, they are really just tearing his flesh off just exactly. This is like Jesus all over again. The nailing to the cross, it's all there on the shroud. Very highly unusual thing. Do I think it's the burial cloth of Jesus? Yes, I do. But here's the reason I do as well. That image could only have been, and here's where the science comes in. That image could only, by the way, that's real blood, by the way. Paints and dyes and vapors, they don't have real hemoglobin. They don't have DNA profiles, and they don't have AB positive blood type, which every single blood stain on the shroud has. And the DNA profile is a Semitic man, just saying. The point I'm just getting to is it seems like it. Now, here's how the image is produced. You just have to take my word for it. The image can't, it's sitting on the very surface of the fibrils of that cloth. So it never penetrates to the middle of the fiber, the medulla of the fiber, and it never penetrates to the middle of the cloth. It couldn't be a vapor. A vapor would easily penetrate to the middle of the fibers and to the middle of the cloth. A dye or a liquid would easily penetrate, go into the middle of the cloth and spangle. No question there. By the way, vapors would be blurry. This is a perfectly precise three-dimensional photographic image on a non-photographically sensitive linen cloth. It's bizarro. Every time you try and get an explanation with dyes, rubs, vapors, anything else that has a chemical origin won't work. Simply won't work. Too many disagreements with the actual image being on the surface of the fibrils. It didn't come from scorching either. Scorching can easily be detected, right, by luminescence. So you can fluoresce it, and of course, if it lights up, like a candle, you'll know right away. Oh, this thing's been scorched. No, there's no scorching on the cloth at all. That leaves us with one physical cause left, only one, and that's light, ladies and gentlemen. But here's how much light you're going to need to produce an image of that quality, that precision. We'll talk about the three dimensions later. And a photographic negative image, this is how much you're going to take. This is proven by Paolo Di Lazzaro and his team and several other teams since. It will take 6 to 8 billion, that's with a B, billion watts of light energy in order to produce that image. 6 to 8 billion watts. That's like 500,000 searchlights worth of light energy coming out of a dead body, which I might add, dead bodies don't normally do. They don't give rise to 6 to 8 billion watts of light energy. This leads us to suspect there might be some transphysical cause, some supernatural cause, because this is not doesn't occur in physics. It really doesn't. And by the way, that light can only last for 1/40 billionth of a second, because if it lasted for 1 microsecond longer than 1/40 billionth of a second, that light would have been so powerful, and the heat energy that accompanied it would have been so powerful, it not only would have snuffed the cloth, it would have even snuffed the smoke that was residual from the cloth being snuffed. And so what I'm trying to get to is 1/40 billionth of a second. We only have one way of replicating that. That's with ARF excimer lasers in a laboratory. In order to produce the image on the Shroud of Turin, it would take 14,000 ARF excimer lasers, which exceeds all the ultraviolet capacity in every single laboratory and in the entire world. That is what came out of that body. That is really unusual. But it gets even more unusual. The cloth had to penetrate the body. It had to collapse into and through the body. I'll just say the body actually has to pass right through the cloth in 1/40 billionth of a second. It's going to have to go through it. Why? Because there are actually photographic images in perfect volumetric proportionality to the surface of the body. There are images of the bones inside the body, the ribs, the hand bones, etc., in volumetric proportionality to the surface, the skin on the body. So that means that the cloth had to penetrate through, or rather, the body just zooms through the cloth at 1/40 billionth of a second. It's through that cloth, and when it's literally leaving an imprint, as it were, behind it, in 6 to 8 billion watts of light energy. That's, by the way, only producible by directional vacuum ultraviolet radiation. And that's seemingly the only explanation we have. We have replicated it in the laboratory. All I'm saying is this is the two places where, according to N.T. Wright, this is where Christian, theology differs from Second Temple Judaism. In the nature of the spiritual body, in the nature of the glorified body, right? The Second Temple Judaism basically favors either, I'm going to be in the Pharisaical tradition here. The Second Temple Judaism favors a resuscitation of the physical body. It was the Christians who said, no, that's going to be a glorified body, almost a divine-like body. And it's going to be a spiritual body, a pneumatikon soma. That's what it's going to be. And it's interesting to note this is precisely what science says that the body in the Shroud of Turin did. When you look at the coincidences between the highly unusual crucifixion of Jesus, which is writ large in the bloodstains on that shroud, and you look at the very unusual requirements for the production of that image by a directional ultraviolet radiation coming from every three-dimensional point inside and outside that body as that body passes through it in 1/40 billionth of a second, you begin to think this could well be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, produced by a transphysical cause, unknown to us, that produces that magnitude of light and that transparency of body. The body becomes mechanically transparent and passes right through the cloth. And in addition to all of it, it's almost like God planned it, that these guys in the late 20th and 21st centuries would sit there and discover all of this stuff which was left behind to be discovered by the most scientifically examined and tested a historical artifact in the world to this day. It's almost like God is saying, from all history, 2,000 years before, gotcha. Anyway, thanks very much, everybody. Science at the doorstep to God.
You're getting a standing ovation.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you very much. I know I went way over time on the questions, so I'll let Phil, what's the time?
Well, if you can stay.
Go ahead and speak from here.
If you'd like to stay, we'll take some questions now. Frank and Della, did you pass out cards? Do we have cards? If you have cards, if you've written a question down, we'll collect them. Otherwise, just pass. We have Frank going through the aisle there, and where's Della? Okay.
Yeah, feel
Anyway,
free to leave.
Yeah, but yeah, do we have a question yet? So, if you okay, go ahead, Brother Pete.
Sure.
So it seems that you consistently refer to physics relationship as hypothesis
Yeah.
of a creator. You seem to refrain from actually saying that science proves the existence of a creator. Why is that?
Because basically it's more than a hypothesis for me. I think it's a reasonable and responsible belief in one, and that science can substantiate it with evidence. But the reason I do that is because science cannot ever establish anything like a metaphysical proof, right? It can't establish something with 100% certainty. Science must always remain open to the possibility that changes could occur, even in our understanding of science itself. We seem to think that we're somewhat advanced now, but of course Newton thought he was very advanced, and then Einstein came along, and Michelson-Morley, and a bunch of other things, and quantum theory, and then you got Bell, a violation of Bell inequality, and they just rewrite the science textbooks all the time. So we want to be at least open to the possibility that there might be some other explanation that might have a natural cause. However, on the other hand, we could also say that the preponderance of evidence favors what I call reasonable and responsible belief based on the scientific evidence that, in fact, God really does exist and there is no physical cause of our universe. There's going to have to be a transphysical and most likely an intelligent cause of that universe. That's the most reasonable and responsible belief we can have. But that's the reason. I don't think anything can be 100% established in science. It's just not part of the scientific methodology, so we always have to remain open to change, and I do, but if you're asking me, does science point in the direction of God or away from God? Definitely in the direction of God. That would be my conclusion. Thank you. Yeah.
This question is, how do you see the science-based Catholics reconciling with the Bible history-based evangelical Christians? Would it help to write a science-based Genesis to help them?
Well, I've had my arguments, I basically leave the arguments with the Protestants among themselves. Because honestly, there are a lot of people like William Lane Craig and a lot of other guys who are my friends who believe in a 13.8 billion year old universe plus or minus 100 million years. That's what they believe. And there's some people who believe in a 6,000 year old universe, which I think from a scientific point of view is utterly ridiculous. It's utterly ridiculous. And so, there's a ton of evidence that, to the contrary. Now, if you want to just write off all of scientific methodology and write off, about 180 years of scientific data, especially the stuff that's come out now with the Planck satellite, the COBE satellite, that's a Cosmic Background Explorer satellite, and the Wilkinson microwave anisotropy satellite, etc. If you're going to just wipe it all out, okay, go for the 6,000-year-old universe. But in the meantime, if you really want to have any scientific plausibility whatsoever, stop it. This is just not worth the time of day. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is we as Catholics don't have to believe this. I mean, way back in 1942, Pope Pius XII wrote Divino Afflante Spiritu, and he said, basically, the job of Scripture is to give, sacred truths necessary for salvation. The job of physics, or science in general, is to give a proper and accurate empirical mathematical description and explanation of the physical universe. Now, they're two different things with two different methods. Now, you can say, well, are there coincidences between the Bible and science? Of course there's coincidences. I mean, I'm utterly shocked by the fact that, so let there be light. This is the first day. Boy, you have no idea how true that is. Scientifically. I mean, it's shocking. This Hebrew author, telling me in 600 BC, coming up with, maybe he intuited it. Okay, maybe God was helping. I don't know. But I can tell you this, if you look at the 6 days of creation, if you look at it from the vantage point of general relativity theory, it's rather interesting. Because, in general relativity theory, right, when you have what's called a compression of curvature of space-time geodesic, right, what happens when the density of mass energy, like at the beginning of the universe, is really dense, you have a super curvature space-time energy, which causes an effect called duration dilation. And duration dilation means that time is getting longer. So one of our days, right, at the beginning of the universe is like worth 8 billion years. Now this guy, Gerhard Schroeder, he's a Jewish guy, really great physicist. I actually did this with all you need to do is plug this into the tensor equations. And coincidentally, I kid you not, if you add up, if you transform, you use a Lorentz-Einstein transformation, but you do it in general relativity through a tensor equation. If you just transform it, for how many of our days, what that was worth, in each of the unfolding moments of the universe when density and duration dilation was much higher, you can actually see that it does come pretty close to about 14 billion years. I'm just saying, it's really weird. Do I think I should be amazed? Well, no, but on the other hand, I don't have to subscribe to that explanation, but stuff like that happens. And so, okay, what's my point? My point is, it doesn't really matter whether you have these nice coincidences or not. The book of Genesis has 4 real important points for our salvation. They're sacred truths. And we can hold these sacred truths along with a complete explanation, physical and scientific explanation and description of the universe. So, for example, number 1, there is but one God. And the biblical authors' point is to say that all these other myths, the Gilgamesh epic, whatever, they're wrong. Because, there's but one God and there's not multiplicity of gods. Number 2, all the things of nature are not gods. They're mere creations of God. There's no sea God, no mountain God. There's sun God. There's just the one God, and he created the sun, the mountains, and the sea all by themselves as mere creatures. That's important for our salvation. Number 3, matter is not evil in itself. It's actually quite good. God looked back on the creation and saw it was good. That's fine. And of course, human beings are made in the very image and likeness of God. Now, that's really important. 4 really important points in the biblical narrative, which you're never going to extract out of physics, I must tell you. Now, for all intents and purposes, you can hold that alongside the physical universe. Catholics, since 1942, have held to, we do not hold to what's called, the dictation theory of inspiration. God comes over and says, Spitzer, here's the text. Take it down exactly like I'm saying it. And I hear this thing going on, and I take it all down, and I write it down. That's called the dictation theory. We never subscribe. We have the co-participative theory of inspiration, where God works inspiring the biblical author who uses his own categories. Why would God want the biblical author to use his own categories? Because quid recipitur est recipitur, you get the point. Whatever is received in the manner of the receiver. Can you imagine if the biblical author suddenly came out and said, in the beginning, there was a super quantum field. And the super quantum field generated from within itself a space-time configuration in the first moment of the unfolding of the 3 other forces of the universe. And then, it goes on and on and on to explain all the eras of the universe in physics and so forth and so on. Finally, you get to, stellar and galactic nucleosynthesis. Every one of those guys would have gone, what? It was like, it would have been worthless. Worthless. To convey what? Sacred truths necessary for salvation. Catholics have always allowed this freedom of biblical interpretation along scientific interpretation. And you know as well as I do that it wasn't just Pope Pius XII and Humani Generis that said Catholics could believe in evolution. St. John Paul II in the Allocution 1989 said this. He went to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, gave an allocution, which is still, it's right on the Maggia Center website. Go to maggiacenter.com, just click on Pope St. John Paul II, message on evolution to the members of the Pontifical Academy. The point I'm trying to get to is we're very free as Catholics to let science be science, to let the scriptures be scriptures, and to be amazed and shocked at the coincidences that occur between the two of them, because you just know there might be some moment, some flicker of inspiration that actually took place. Anyway, that's a thought for today, but that answers the question.
Another question. I'm picking up now, good. Near-death experience evidence seems to be compatible with a non-physical and better perceiving soul, as in Platonism. Or is the soul in a spiritual body, as in Christianity?
Yeah, here's the deal. The soul that comes out in the near-death experience certainly is not a pure Platonic soul. It has some sense of extension. So it has a sense of motion. And it does have, the components of a kind of embodiment. When somebody sees deceased relatives, as they say, on the other side there in this heavenly domain, they also have a look of embodiment as well. Now, that's not the whole story of what we shall become, because at the end of time, we are told we are going to be like Christ. But when Christ appeared, he wasn't just transphysical. He wasn't just consciousness in the sense of an extended body that can transcend physical laws and things of that nature, though he did pass through walls and do other things that we see are very typical in near-death experiences. But he's glorious. He's really just remember I was saying about transformed in light, transformed in this glorious body embodiment. We will become like him. So we, at the last judgment, if we're already in the heavenly kingdom, I really believe we're not just going to stay in a transphysical soul, extended kind of body, soul body, if I can put it that way, which is, not a Platonic soul at all. We're actually going to be very much a glorified body in the sense of transformed in light, but above all, more importantly, transformed in love, because we will be freed from every bit of egocentricity and narcissism in us, and we'll get to see one another as we really are. And if we saw one another as we really are, in the unique goodness and lovability without any of the obstructions of egocentricity and narcissism, you would be so stunned at the utter beauty and lovability of that other person. It would transfix you into time standing still out of sheer joy, just from one other human being, let alone God himself. This is what awaits us. And so we should be anticipating even more than what's in a near-death experience. But of course, we can't empirically, in any way get verifiable data, veridical data on that because it hasn't happened yet. It will happen at the last trumpet, as St. Paul says. Thank you.
All right, we'll take one or two more questions. This one is written, Jesus said the road to hell is wide and the road to heaven narrow. Why then, or how do you explain why so many NDEs have the experience of a white light or heaven when the idea of sin has been so diminished or lost in our world?
Yeah, here's the deal with the exegesis on this passage has been significant, but here's the major thing to think about. Jesus said the road to perdition is wide indeed, and many people follow it. But he doesn't say there that they follow it into hell. He just says people are going down the wide road. And we ought to be trying to rescue them even if they're halfway down. Absolutely, we should. And God is trying to rescue them as they're halfway down. So you don't want to infer from they go on the road to perdition that they actually went to hell. That's not a valid conclusion. Secondly, the road to heaven is the gateway to heaven is narrow indeed, very difficult to get through. But we have the grace of God. We have confession and absolution. We have repentance even at the 9th hour, even at the last second. We have the possibility of repentance. There's all kinds of, so we don't want to infer that nobody's getting into heaven, and we certainly don't want to infer from that passage that more people are going to hell than are going to heaven. I mean, all Jesus is doing is giving a big, huge warning. It's real easy to go down the path to perdition. As if you came to my talk last night, level 1 and level 2 are out there in force, and the devil knows how to use it and how to drag you by the nose once you submit. Once you say, I'm going to just be fundamentally disobedient, I'm going to, he knows how to use it. So, yeah, he's giving us warning. He's just practically screaming at us, don't do it. Just don't go down there. Try and stick with, grace and follow me, follow my word. And if you got off the road, go to confession and start going back to Mass. Just get, back on the road. That's what he's trying to warn us to do. Now, vis-a-vis near-death experiences, because that's the real question. But I just want to make sure the exegesis on this passage, you're not inferring more people are going to hell than heaven. That's not what the passage says. And it's not meant to say that. It's meant to be a warning against going down the easier path, which is the path to perdition, which is wide indeed. I totally agree. I've started on that path a few times in my life, and I'm so glad I've at least had some grace to get me off it. But here's the point to make. The NDEs, here, compare these statistics. 85% of children who have an NDE, who undergo clinical death, let me repeat that. 85% of children who undergo clinical death, flat EEG, fixed dilated, heart attack, drowning, whatever, accident. Okay, their heart stops beating. 85% of them will have a near-death experience. 85%. 100% of that 85% of experiences is good. That's for children. Now compare that to adults. In adults, of the people who have undergo clinical death, only 20% of adults have a near-death experience. Yes, the majority of them is good, but 4% really are quite dark indeed. Quite dark. Now, Parnia thinks it might be a higher percentage. But it's the 80% that always gave me pause. Why do 80% of adults not have a near-death experience? Is it because they're going to purgatory? I don't know. Is it because they haven't been judged yet? I do not know. Is it because, in some sense, there is work that has to be done to get them off the road to perdition? I do not know. Is it a combination of all three of these things? Don't know. But if I were a betting man, I'd bet on Catholic doctrine. I'd bet that it's all three. I bet they haven't been judged. I bet, for all intents and purposes, a lot of them need a little bit of purgatory. I certainly probably will. And I bet anything else, too, that there's work to be done before they can even get on the path. And God is, in some sense, giving them the benefit of the doubt. Now, Parnia says that, the number of dark experiences is higher than the Pim van Lommel percentages. I'm not sure what the case is. But anyway, it seems like the heavenly experiences in the people who do have a near-death experience, that's 20% of the adults, that the vast majority are quite good. And maybe 4%, maybe as many as 6% are dark. But the point, nevertheless, is still important. 80% simply don't have any experience at all. And we must be open to a Catholic doctrinal interpretation of that condition. Thanks.
Well, folks, let's call this evening to a close, but would you join me in thanking this remarkable man?
Thank you very much.